The pen was heavier than I expected. That's the first thing I remember thinking when my son-in-law slid it across the polished oak table toward me. A black Mont Blanc, the kind of pen people buy when they want you to feel the weight of what you're about to sign. I let it sit there for a moment. I didn't reach for it. I just looked at it, and then I looked at my daughter, and then I looked at the lawyer she brought with her. And I waited. My name is Pearl. I'm 68 years old, and I've been a widow for 9 years this November. I worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Hartford for 31 years before I retired. That detail is going to matter later, so I'm telling you now. But let me back up. Let me tell you about that morning, before any of this happened, because I think you need to understand what kind of life I was living before my own child decided I wasn't fit to keep living it. The morning of the meeting, I made coffee the way I always did. 1 scoop, not 2. Cream from the small carton, because the big one always went bad before I finished it. I stood at the kitchen window and watched a cardinal land on the edge of the bird feeder my husband Howard built the spring before he passed. The feeder was crooked now. I'd meant to fix it for years. Somehow I never did. Maybe I didn't want to. The phone rang at 7:45. It was my granddaughter, Beatrice. She's 22, finishing up nursing school down in New Haven. She called me every Sunday morning and most Tuesdays, and that morning was a Tuesdays. "Grandma, you eating breakfast? I'm having coffee, sweetheart." "That's not breakfast, it's breakfast adjacent." She laughed at that. She always laughed at the things her mother rolled her eyes at, and that's something I'd noticed a long time ago. The same words, the same little jokes, the same tone of voice. One of them found me funny, the other one found me tedious. I don't know exactly when my daughter Charlotte stopped finding me anything at all, but I know it was a long time before that Tuesday. Beatrice asked if I had plans for the day. I told her I had an appointment. Nothing exciting, just paperwork. I didn't tell her what kind. I didn't want her to worry, and I didn't want to give her mother any reason to come down on her for interfering. That's the word Charlotte used when Beatrice took my side on anything. Interfering, as if loving your grandmother were some kind of trespass. "Call me when you're done," she said. "I want to hear about your day." "It's just errands, honey. Call me anyway." I told her I would. I meant it. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time with my hands wrapped around the coffee cup. I knew what was coming that afternoon. Charlotte had told me a week earlier that she'd found a wonderful estate planning attorney and that she wanted to help me get my affairs in order. Those were her exact words. I remember because I wrote them down on the back of an electric bill after she left the kitchen, the way you write down things you might need to remember later, the way I used to write down things at work when a client said something that didn't quite add up. Charlotte is 43. She lives 20 minutes away in a development called Heritage Pines, in a 4-bedroom colonial that she and her husband Marcus bought 5 years ago and have been complaining about the mortgage on ever since. She works in pharmaceutical sales. Marcus owns a landscaping company that, from what I can gather, employs 4 men and a leaf blower. They have 1 child, my Beatrice, who escaped to nursing school and rarely came home anymore unless I was the reason for the visit. I should also tell you that my husband and I had been careful with money our entire lives. Not rich, not even what you call comfortable by some standards. But we paid off the house in 1998. We saved. We didn't take vacations we couldn't afford, and we didn't put anything on credit that we couldn't pay off in a month. By the time Howard died, between his pension, the small inheritance from my mother, and the life insurance, I had something close to $400,000 in retirement accounts and a house that was paid for, sitting in a neighborhood where homes had started selling for over $600,000. That's not a fortune, but it's not nothing. And to a daughter and son-in-law with a mortgage they couldn't quite carry, it might as well have been a winning lottery ticket sitting in a Tupperware container. Charlotte didn't visit me much in the years after Howard died. She came on holidays if she felt like it. She sent flowers on my birthday twice. She forgot once. The other 3 times, I wasn't sure what happened. But about 18 months ago, things changed. She started dropping by. She started bringing me homemade soup, which surprised me because I didn't know she could make soup. She started asking me how I was sleeping, whether I was eating enough, whether I'd been to the doctor lately. She asked me 3 separate times in 2 months whether I was having any trouble remembering things. I'm telling you, the moment a person who hasn't called you in 6 months starts asking whether you're remembering things, you should pay attention. I paid attention. Now, back to the morning of the meeting. At 9, I drove myself to the bank. I keep saying I drove myself because in the weeks leading up to that day, Charlotte had offered to drive me places, no fewer than 11 times. I started counting after the 4th offer. I'd been driving for 52 years. I had a perfect record. I'd never had a ticket. But suddenly my daughter was very concerned about my driving. At the bank, I walked into the branch manager's office. His name is Wendell. He'd worked at that branch for 23 years, and he'd known Howard. He stood up when I came in and he hugged me, the way he always did, and he asked how I was doing. "Wendell," I said, "I need a favor." He sat me down. I told him what I'd been seeing. The visits, the questions, the soup, the mention of an attorney. I told him my daughter had asked me twice in the last month what would happen to my accounts if something happened to me. I told him she'd asked whether I'd ever considered making her a joint owner so things would be easier. Wendell didn't say much while I was talking. When I was done, he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "Pearl," he said, "I'm going to tell you something and I want you to listen carefully. Anyone tries to add a name to your accounts, you call me first. I don't care who it is. You call me. And as of this morning, I'm putting a note on your file that any change requires you in person with 2 forms of ID and a phone call to the number on file, not the number anyone else gives me, the one I have, yours." I sat there and I felt my eyes sting. I'm not crazy, am I, Wendell? He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Pearl, you are the sharpest woman I know, and I've been waiting for you to come in and have this conversation. I've been waiting longer than you'd think." That hit me harder than I expected, because what he was saying, without saying it, was that he had seen this before with other clients, other widows, other mothers. He'd seen this exact pattern enough times to know what it looked like. I left the bank at 10. By 11, I was sitting in the office of an estate attorney named Helena Briarwood on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown in a neighborhood I hadn't been to in years. I called her 2 weeks earlier on the recommendation of a friend from my old firm. Helena had been an associate at a competing practice when I was paralegaling in the late 90s. She remembered me. She'd been gracious about it. We'd already met twice before. That morning was the 3rd meeting, and the purpose was to finalize my own trust, not the one Charlotte was bringing to me that afternoon. Mine. The one she didn't know existed. Helena walked me through every page. We'd already done the bulk of the work in the previous 2 meetings. The trust named Beatrice as my primary beneficiary, with a small portion set aside for the senior literacy program at the county library, where I'd volunteered for the past 7 years. There was a modest provision for Charlotte. Modest because I am not cruel and she is still my child. But small because I will not reward what I was watching her try to do. The trust was irrevocable upon execution. The home had already been transferred into it 3 weeks earlier. I had a successor trustee named, a banker recommended by Wendell, vetted by Helena, with a fiduciary duty that would survive whatever Charlotte might attempt. I had a durable power of attorney for health care in the hands of Beatrice, with explicit instructions and a notarized statement of competency dated that very week, signed by my doctor. Her name was Patricia Linwood, who'd known me for 15 years and who took one look at me when I asked for the evaluation and said, "Pearl, what's going on?" I told her. She did the evaluation, dated and notarized, and slid it across her desk to me with a look that said, "Whatever you need." I had everything. Every piece, every signature, every safeguard. Helena had done it the right way, and I had done it the careful way, and we'd done it quietly. I signed the last document at 11:32 on the morning of the meeting with my daughter. Helena witnessed. Her notary witnessed. I left her office with a sealed envelope of certified copies and an address book of every professional I might need to call. I drove home. I made myself a tuna sandwich. I ate half of it. I changed into the navy blue dress I wear to anything serious, the one with the small pearl buttons that Howard bought me for our 35th anniversary. I put on the pearl earrings my mother left me. I brushed my hair. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. Then I drove to my daughter's lawyer's office. The office was in a glass and chrome building out by the highway, the kind of place that looked expensive in a way that real lawyers never look expensive. Charlotte was already there when I pulled in. So was Marcus. Charlotte stood up when I walked through the door of the conference room, and the first thing she said was, "Mom, are you sure you didn't want me to drive you?" "I drove just fine, dear. I just worry." "I know you do." The lawyer's name was Garrett. He was maybe 35, with a haircut that cost more than my hairdresser charged for a perm, and a tie that was knotted in a way that suggested he'd watched a YouTube video about it that morning. He shook my hand. His hand was damp. I noted that. I note a lot of things. 31 years in legal work will do that to you. We sat down. Charlotte sat to my left. Marcus sat to my right. Garrett sat across from me, with a folder open in front of him and a pen. The heavy black one, lying across the top page. "Pearl," he said. "Charlotte has explained the situation to me, and I just want to start by saying how much I admire the proactive approach you're all taking here. Estate planning is a gift to your family." "I'm sure it is," I said. "What we have here," he went on, "is a fairly straightforward revocable trust. It would consolidate your assets, provide for Charlotte and Marcus to handle administrative matters as you age, and ensure a smooth transition of your estate. It's really very protective, is it? Now, there's just a few key provisions I want to walk you through. The first is the trustee designation. Charlotte would be named as primary trustee, with full authority over the trust assets. The second is a healthcare clause that gives her decision-making authority should there be any question about your capacity. The third— "Mom doesn't really need to follow all the legal language," Charlotte said, cutting in, smiling at Garrett like he was a waiter she was trying to charm. "She gets confused with that stuff. She was never really, a paperwork person." I sat very still. "I was a paralegal for 31 years, Charlotte." "I know, Mom, but that was a long time ago. Things have changed. The law is different now." "The law isn't different, dear. The law is largely the same. The estate code in this state hasn't been substantially revised since 2009. I read the latest amendments when they were published. I subscribed to the Bar Journal. I still get the Bar Journal." There was a silence. Garrett's smile flickered, just slightly. Marcus shifted in his seat. Charlotte laughed, a high, brittle laugh, and looked at Garrett. "She's been reading those old work magazines again. It's sweet. She doesn't really understand any of this, but she likes to feel involved." I looked at her. I looked at her for a long, long time. Long enough for the silence to settle into the room and for Garrett to start to look uncomfortable. Long enough for Charlotte's smile to twitch. "Charlotte," I said, "do you remember what I did for a living? Mom, please, we talked about this. I just want to make sure. Do you remember what I did for a living for 31 years? She didn't answer. "I drafted documents like the one in front of you. I drafted them. I reviewed them. I caught errors in them, and on more than one occasion, I caught attorneys trying to slide language past elderly clients that the clients would not have agreed to if they had read carefully. I worked under 3 different partners over my career, and the last of them, the one I retired under, used to send me his trickiest drafts because, as he liked to say, I had a nose for nonsense." I reached across the table and I picked up the folder. I slid it in front of me. I picked up the pen, that heavy Mont Blanc, and I held it in my hand. But I did not uncap it. I started reading. I read out loud. I read every single line. When I got to the trustee provision, I read it slowly. When I got to the trustee provision, I read it slowly. When I got to the capacity clause, I read it twice. This clause, I said, states that my capacity may be evaluated and determined by a single physician of the trustee's choosing, without my involvement, without independent review, and without my right to contest the finding within the trust framework. Is that what this says, Garrett? Garrett opened his mouth. Then he closed it. It's standard language, Charlotte said. Garrett said it's standard. Did he? I said. Garrett, is this standard? Did he? I said. Garrett, is this standard language? It's one form of the clause. There are several, including ones that require independent medical evaluation, including ones that require court approval, including ones that allow the grantor, that's me, to designate her own physician for purposes of any such evaluation. Why was the most restrictive version selected, Mom? Don't mom me, Charlotte. I'm asking the attorney. Garrett. Why this version? It was, Charlotte indicated that, given the circumstances. What circumstances? He was sweating. I could see it at his hairline. Garrett, I said, my voice still calm, still pleasant. I had not raised my voice once. I am going to be honest with you. I had not even felt like raising my voice, because anger wasn't what I was feeling. What I was feeling was something cleaner, something colder, something I'd felt only a handful of times in my life, and that I had learned a long time ago was the most useful thing a woman could feel when men in suits were trying to take something from her. Did my daughter represent to you that I had been showing signs of cognitive decline? Charlotte said. Mom, that's not, Garrett. She mentioned some concerns. What concerns? Forgetfulness, confusion about finances, difficulty managing daily affairs. I see. I set the document down. I capped the pen, even though I had never uncapped it, and I set it on top of the document, perfectly aligned with the edge of the page. I looked at Charlotte. Sweetheart, I said, and I meant it because she was still my daughter, and I have always called her that. Let me tell you what's going to happen now. Mom, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Let me tell you what's going to happen. I am not going to sign this document. I am not going to sign any document presented to me today, or any document presented to me by an attorney I did not retain. I am going to take this folder home with me because it contains correspondence between you and Mr. Kennedy. Garrett, that I am entitled to as the proposed grantor of the trust, and I am going to forward copies of it to my own attorney. Your own attorney, Charlotte said. Yes, dear, my own attorney. Helena Briarwood. You may have heard of her. She's been practicing estate law in this state for 31 years. You? Since when? Since 2 months ago when you started bringing me soup. Marcus made a sound. I wasn't sure if it was a laugh or a cough. Charlotte turned and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her turn back to me with an expression I had never seen on her before. It was something like fear. It was also something like rage. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt to see, because it did. She is my child. I gave birth to her in a hospital in Bridgeport in the spring of 1983, and I held her against my chest, and I promised her things I have kept every one of, even when she stopped wanting them. Mom, she said, and her voice cracked, you don't understand what I was trying to do. I understand exactly what you were trying to do. You were trying to install yourself as trustee with a capacity clause loose enough that within 6 months you could have had me declared incompetent by any general practitioner willing to take a check. You were trying to take my home, my accounts, and my decisions out of my hands, and you were going to dress it up as concern. Mom, control wears a lot of costumes, sweetheart. Concern is a popular one. She started to cry. I will tell you something I am not proud of, which is that I felt very little when she cried. I felt distant. I felt like I was watching her cry from across a river. I have cried for that child more times than I can count. I cried when she got sick at 4 years old and we didn't know what was wrong. I cried when she got her heart broken at 16. I cried at her wedding. I cried when she handed me Beatrice for the first time. I have spent a lifetime crying for Charlotte. That afternoon, in that conference room, I had no tears left for her. I had used them all up the night before, alone in my kitchen, when I'd realized that the woman who'd been bringing me soup was the same little girl I'd held in a hospital, and that something had gone wrong somewhere along the way, and that I would never know exactly when or why. Garrett cleared his throat. Mrs. Pearl, maybe we should reschedule. There's nothing to reschedule, Garrett. There won't be another meeting. You'll be hearing from Ms. Briarwood by the end of the week. I picked up my purse. I tucked the folder under my arm. I stood up. I walked to the door. At the door I stopped, because there was one more thing I needed to say, and it wasn't to Garrett. Charlotte, I said, without turning around, Beatrice asked about my day this morning. She's going to ask about it again tonight. I haven't decided yet when I'm going to tell her. I'd like you to think about that. I walked out. I got in my car. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I thought they would be, but they were steady on the wheel when I finally pulled out, and I drove home, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table where Howard used to read the paper, and I called Beatrice. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Grandma, can I come this weekend? I want to see you." "You don't have to. I want to." She came that Friday. She brought a bag of groceries because she said my fridge was a tragedy, which it was, and she made me a real dinner, and we sat on the porch afterward in the cool September air and watched the light change in the maples. She didn't ask me a lot of questions about her mother. She just sat with me. She held my hand at one point and she said, "I love you, Grandma. Whatever happens with Mom, I love you, and I'm not going anywhere." I told her I loved her, too. I told her she was the best thing her mother and I had ever made between us. Helena called Charlotte's lawyer the following Monday. Whatever was said in that conversation, I never asked about. I only know that Garrett sent over the entire file the next day with a cover letter so deferential it was almost embarrassing. Helena reviewed it. She told me there was enough in there, between the inflated capacity clause and Charlotte's representations, to file a complaint with the state bar if I wanted to. I thought about it for a few days. In the end, I told her no. I told her I didn't need to take a young man's career down. I just needed him to understand that the next time someone like my daughter walked into his office, he should ask harder questions. I haven't heard from Charlotte much since. She called once, the week after the meeting, and left a long voicemail in which she cried and said things that were partly apologies and partly excuses, the way her father's mother used to do. And I listened to it, twice, and I didn't call her back. I haven't decided yet what to do with my daughter. I'm 68 years old, and I've decided I don't need to decide everything on a deadline. Some decisions you make slowly, some you make over years. She is still my child. I will probably let her come back, eventually, in some form. But not the way she was. Not the version of her that brought me soup with a claws hidden in the broth. In the meantime, I keep the bird feeder in the yard. I still haven't fixed the crooked one. Maybe I never will. Howard built it the way he built it, and it tilts the way it tilts, and the cardinals come anyway. Beatrice calls me on Sundays and Tuesdays. Mrs. Halloway from across the street brought over a casserole last Thursday for no reason at all. The library asked if I wanted to take on another reading group, and I said yes. The pen sat on the table. I didn't pick it up. That's the thing I want you to remember, if you remember anything from this. The pen sat on the table, and they wanted me to pick it up, and I didn't. You don't have to pick up the pen. No matter how heavy it is, no matter who is sliding it toward you, no matter what they call you when you refuse, you don't have to pick up the pen. You can just sit there and look at it and decide. I've thought about that afternoon a lot in the months since. Not the way you'd think. not with anger, not most of the time. What I keep coming back to is something quieter than that. It's the question of how a person becomes the kind of person who would do what Charlotte tried to do, and I don't have a clean answer. I don't think there is one. What I do believe, after 68 years of paying attention, is that nothing happens by accident. Not really. Everything that walked into that conference room with Charlotte that day had been built, slowly, over years. Every shortcut she'd ever taken. Every time someone hadn't pushed back when she should have been pushed back. Every time she'd learned that a smile and the right tone of voice could get her past a hard conversation. None of that was sudden. By the time she sat down across from me with that lawyer of hers, she'd been practicing for that meeting her whole adult life. And she didn't even know it. That's the thing about the way our choices shape us. They don't announce themselves. They move in quietly, and they put their feet up, and they make themselves comfortable. And one day you look around and the house you're living in isn't the one you thought you'd built. I think that's what happened to my daughter. I don't say that to excuse her. I say it because I want to be honest about the cost of letting small wrongs go uncorrected, in yourself and in the people you raise. I tell you what saved me that day. It wasn't luck. It wasn't toughness, exactly. Though I'd like to think I have some of that. What saved me was that I'd kept my mind awake. I'd kept reading. I'd kept paying attention to the world. When Charlotte stood there and told a stranger that her mother didn't understand things, she was speaking about a woman who didn't exist. The woman she was describing was the one she needed me to be, and the only reason I could correct her was that, year after year, I had refused to become that woman. Strength is one thing. Knowledge is another. But the third thing, the one I think gets less credit than it deserves, is the simple decision to keep your dignity intact when nobody around you seems to require it of you. To dress for the meeting. To read every line. To speak calmly when someone is trying to make you small. That isn't pride. That's the floor underneath the rest of the house. To anyone watching this who has felt the quiet creep of someone trying to manage you, to drive you, to handle you, listen to me. You are not paranoid for noticing. You are not unkind for protecting yourself. Loving someone does not mean letting them decide what your life becomes. It means staying whole enough to keep loving them on your own terms. Pick up the book. Make the call to your Wendell, whoever that is for you. Sit down at your own kitchen table and decide who you are. And then when the pen comes sliding across the polished wood, you'll know exactly what to do with it.